Well, thank you all for coming. Many years ago, I would teach graduate courses at Kent State, and they were small and elite groups. So we will look upon ourselves as a small and elite group looking to seek after more knowledge. Well, the talk today is called Land of Liberty, and my name is Phil Weeks. And for a number of years, I taught at Kent State and retired as Professor Emeritus of History at Kent State. And over the course of my academic career, was interested in researching and writing and talking to students about a variety of topics. One of the topics that interested me early on was the foreign policy of the United States towards American Indians, and wrote a couple of books dealing with that, Farewell My Nation, The American Indian Experience, They Made Us Many Promises, Subjugation and Dishonor. I was also interested in presidential history, and in 2003 the state of Ohio had, with the bicentennial of the state that year, asked for projects, and I did a book called Buckeye Presidents that details the 7 presidents from Ohio, equal to Virginia's 7 presidents who served in the White House. One they share, so it's actually 8, 7 and 7 plus 1. But perhaps the book that I was most interested in terms of getting down the ideas that I had developed over many, many years of reading and thinking about the history of the United States was the concept of liberty. And that's what we're going to talk about today. In fact, the concept of liberty ultimately came out in this textbook that I co-authored, which is called Land of Liberty. And it was to bring about the idea of liberty was so critical in the minds of the foundings individuals of the United States, and where has it gone, or is it gone? How has it been modified? If so, how has it been modified? Why was it important? And perhaps why it's not so important today? And the book was to try to give a factual, authentic, non-PC description of the history of the United States, geared for the particular level of the students who will be reading the book. So, Land of Liberty. Land of Liberty, ultimately, that concept led me into Ron Paul. The one that really changed my whole, perhaps ambivalent attitude towards Ron Paul was called The Revolution, a Manifesto, which our son gave us. He and his wife had been on the bandwagon, young people, 4 or 5 years ago, and he said, well, Dad, have you ever read this? And I said, no, really haven't. And he said, well, you should think about it in terms of my course. And so I read it. Ultimately bought copies of it in paperback and used to keep it in my office so that when I would build these ideas into my courses, without attribution, not always saying Ron Paul, Ron Paul, Ron Paul, but when somebody would come and say, well, these ideas are intriguing, where might I look further into it? I'd say, oh, well, here's a book I can loan you, you know, this really, and that would be a way of sort of subtly, but directly getting the message out. Of course, Ron Paul's newer book is called Liberty Defined, in which it's more or less an encyclopedia topically of major ideas that are germane to today's society, and he applies the concept of liberty to these various ideas. But this one, the manifesto, was, I thought, the really magnus opus. It was the superb book that Ron Paul wrote and changed my mind. So with that said, having thought about liberty for a long time and building it into lectures and into books, but ultimately running into a candidate that seemed to reflect these ideas, I began to think about, well, where does liberty show up critically in major discourses in American history? And I think back to July of 1863. And in July of 1863, in a little town in southeastern Pennsylvania called Gettysburg, the armies of the Confederate States of America, led by Robert E. Lee, and the armies of the United States of America, led by George McClellan, clashed in what became not just the greatest bloodbath in American history, but the most titanic battle ever fought in the Western Hemisphere. In fact, by the time that day ended, almost 60,000 Americans had perished in 3 days of fighting along the hills of southeastern Pennsylvania. Well, there were so many people that were killed or died of their wounds thereafter. The people of Gettysburg, that only numbered about 4,000 people, applied to the federal government for assistance to build a federal cemetery there because they were afraid of all the decaying bodies would produce an epidemic. And so the government, which was pretty tight-fisted with money historically, allowed the money to be sent to Gettysburg to build the federal cemetery that is now there on the battlefield grounds. And in November, President Lincoln was asked to come to offer statements, commentary about the Battle of Gettysburg. Because he was so busy, they invited perhaps the greatest orator of the day. His name was Edward Everett, and he was to come and to speak, as it turned out, 2 hours, which of course the gauge of a professor, the gauge of a preacher, the gauge of a speaker in that time period was how long you could orate. Well, Lincoln gets up and he offers a commentary that probably didn't last more than a couple minutes, the famous Gettysburg Address. And although it received great applause, the newspapers afterwards chastised him on dishwashery, silly talk because it was so brief. Remember, the criteria of good speeches was length, not content. But in time, it became one of the great speeches of American history. And in it, Abraham Lincoln goes back to the concept of the founding of the country. Because remember, he says 77 years ago, which is 87 years. It's 20. So 7 years ago. 87 years ago, our forefathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. But if we go to our mental calculators and try to figure out, all right, if this was November of 1863, and he's referencing back 87 years and the birth of the country, one would think that you would land at 1787 with the Constitution, because that is indeed the birth of the current government of the United States. We've had 2 in our histories, we'll see. That was the second government of the United States. But he didn't. If you take 87 and subtract it from 1863, it takes you back to 1776. And what he's referencing, of course, was Thomas Jefferson's great Declaration of Independence, in which Thomas Jefferson says that we hold these truths to be self-evident. It's clear to anybody that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. We often pronounce that as unalienable, but the word really is unalienable. And if you think about a property, buying your car, buying your house, a lien is put against it till you pay the debt. And what Jefferson is saying is these rights that have been given to you by God, no lien can ever be put against them. They are yours. You possess them 100%. Here's the deed. And so it is, we are endowed with certain unalienable rights. Among them, very careful phrase, which is a non-inclusive preposition. He's not saying this is the whole list. He's just saying this is illustrative of a much longer list of what? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then, of course, we move forward to 1787 with the Constitution, and there, in one of the fascinating intros, the preambles of a political document, it says, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, and then they espouse 5 different positions why this government was founded. We'll talk about them all in just a little bit, but the last one is to preserve the blessings of what? Liberty for ourselves and our posterity. So clearly the idea of liberty is central to the American experience, and clearly the idea of liberty is also important to the American experience. And unfortunately, we tend to define liberty these days as pretty much just more anarchy. Doing anything you wish, however you want. And they didn't mean it that way in the slightest. It was a great term with responsibility attached to it. You have the liberty to do whatever you want as long as it doesn't cross the line of impinging on the liberty and the rights of other people. So let's look at the concept of liberty here in terms of the founders and the birth of the United States. And if we just for a second go back in time a little bit, you recall that there were a number of European powers that moved to establish empires in the New World following Christopher Columbus's great discovery. The Spanish came first, then the Portuguese came, the Swedes did for a little bit, didn't do much, the Dutch did for a little bit, didn't do too much, but then came the British and the French and the great contest for North America. Well, Britain established its first permanent colony at Jamestown, Virginia in 1607, and so the colonial period runs essentially from 07 to 1775, a little less than 12 years from the Revolution. And I think we'll see in a second why we have to stop the colonial period at that point, and then we begin to get into the pre-revolutionary crisis from 1775 onward, okay? But if we characterize the colonial period and look at the speeches from politicians, the speeches from editorialists, the speeches from citizens, I think we can draw this conclusion that if most colonial Americans embraced one critical value regarding themselves and government, it was this: that government is essentially the negation of liberty. So if we assert that liberty is, as Lincoln put it, as Jefferson put it, as the Constitution put it, central, and yet we are going to establish a government, the question always is, how do you balance the two concepts? How do you make them mesh well? The government is essentially the negation of liberty.
What does negation mean then?
To reduce it, to make it ineffective, to ultimately decrease its power.
Or an opposite.
Yes, exactly. It's the opposite of liberty, right? If liberty is your freedom, government reduces that freedom. So Thomas Jefferson later echoed these sentiments when he asserted that the government that governs least governs best. And to his generation, he probably would have had a standing ovation of amens as he made that statement, because that reflected, in a nutshell, how early Americans felt about the concept of the balance of government and liberty. Oh, you needed government, there was no doubt about that. But how do you build government around this new concept of liberty that is to embrace the doctrine of liberty? Well, if we were to go from 1607 to 1775, I think there's really two eras involving liberty during the colonial period. Between roughly 1607 to 1763, Great Britain governs the colonies in a style that was characterized by Americans as they put it, salutary neglect. Now, we don't use the term salutary much any longer, but it was a popular word in the late 1700s, and it simply meant positive or good. You know, for example, if you went to buy your buggy in 1763 and they said, well, we've cut the price in half, your response would be, that's salutary. Or if you went to your final exam in college and they said, well, you're all getting an A, go home, there's no final, all the students would walk down the hallway saying, well, that was salutary. That's how the term would be used in that time period. So it sounds funny to us, but what Americans said in the colonial period is that because Britain did not assert its authority heavy-handedly, that was what? Good neglect. Positive neglect. Positive because it allowed American society to develop with its own values and beliefs centered around this idea of limited government and the protection of liberty. Liberty was protected for Americans. But then, between 1763 and 1775, the relationship between the colonials and the British government falls apart and ends in revolution. And the question becomes why? Now notice that we had almost a century and a half of very positive relationships, or at least cordial relationships between the mother country and the colonies, and all of a sudden, between the time the child was in first grade to graduating from high school, it fell apart. It's very rapid. And it's very rapid, I think, for a very specific reason. Britain implements policies in those years, 63 to 75, usually by means of taxation and confiscation of firearms, to make clear to the colonists that it can what? It can assert its authority over Americans. And that was the burr under the saddle. That was the thing that drove the Americans crazy. Is that the government that governs least governs best. It's been a positive relationship because they pretty much let us alone, kept their hands off of us. But now they create policies to demonstrate we can assert our authority over you. Of course, taxation is one of the very common ways in which government says, if I can reach in your pocket and take out what's yours and make it mine, then I rule. Right? Taxation is a very common technique. In fact, there was an old cliche that said that the ability to tax is the ability to rule. They can take your private property, they've got you. And of course, because this was a continent in which most Americans were armed, they moved against the arms to prove we can limit your ability to use these arms. And when they put those two together, taxation and going after the arms, revolution ensued.
Was there an impetus on why the crown all of a sudden shifted from that?
There was, yes. Part of the problem is that they had always disliked the policy of salutary neglect, but because there had been almost 80 years of fighting the French in Canada and around through the Ohio country and down the Mississippi River, they really had to be careful with the colonies because they needed their support to fight the French. But once they finally drove the French from North America in 1763. Now we can get down to what we'd already intended on doing 170 years ago. But now it's too late because...
They want to gain profits from their colonies.
Oh, yes, exactly, yes.
Support their empire building everywhere else.
Exactly, and they wanted to make sure the Americans understood, you are under us. You're not just ancillary to us. But the problem is that if you raise your children with certain beliefs, and they raise their children, they raise their children, they raise their children, they raise their children, all of a sudden someone comes along and says, we're eliminating all this is the new way. What does that produce? A resentment. And that's essentially how America came, because it was positive, remember, not just because they laid their hands off, but because they laid their hands off, it allowed us to build a new world with new values, new society, new social mobility, etc. You know, they really believed it was a new world, not just merely a Xerox of the old. And they're very proud of this new world and its values, and they saw the old world now coming to swamp it out, or at least to diminish it. And so it's the assertion of authority that ultimately from government was seen as a threat to liberty, and Americans responded accordingly. Now, as they approached the revolution, remember that most American colonists were religious to one degree or another. Some were just nominally religious, others were fervently religious, but most Americans did assert that they were somehow tied to the deity. In fact, the message now began to come from the pulpits. What is happening? It came from the politicians. What is happening? It came from the newspaper people. What is happening? It came from the lawyers. What is happening? Again, it was a general society that began to ask the question, if the government that governs least, that governs best, how do we handle the assertion of authority coming down on our society? And because they were religious, they had formulated an idea that now enters this mainstream of the revolution. And the question had been for a very long time about power and government. What is the source of power? Now, if we were to go down the right-hand side, and one of my friends loaned me, if I don't know where I put it, one of these neat pointers. Anyways, if we go down the right-hand side, or if on your side, the right-hand side column, that would be the historic way in which people asserted power and demonstrated the legitimacy of power to government. For example, we have monarchy, which is ruled by a king or queen, tyranny, by a tyrant, oligarchy by a powerful few, theocracy by religious leaders, plutocracy by the wealthy, and the rights are arbitrarily allotted to the people by these governments. So whichever of the above applies to your particular society, the rights that you as citizens enjoy is because of what? They granted you those rights arbitrarily, and thus at the bottom, these rights can be arbitrarily taken back. Did you find it there? Thank you. Arbitrarily taken back by the, there we go, like shooting range. Arbitrarily taken back by the monarch, tyrant, oligarch, theocrat, plutocrat. So the idea is that they asserted this was called the divine right of monarchy. Power came from God to the monarch, or the theocrat, or the oligarch, or the plutarch. And they in turn gave some of it to you, which they could pull back whenever they wish. And it could be arbitrarily. I did it because I felt like doing it. I don't have to answer why. I did it because I gave it to you and I could take it back. And the Americans in the colonies, as well as a few in Europe at this time, known as the Enlightenment, were developing a whole new concept with regard to power. And that is that inalienable rights, well shoot, you're born with them. It wasn't in the king's repository that he gave to you. Please come and sit down. Government is established by the will of the people to protect their inalienable rights. Why is the government in France of Louis XVI existing? To support Louis XVI. Why do you go to war? To support his agenda. Why do you pay taxes? To support his regime. And they said, no. Government is established by the will of the people to protect those rights that we have from God. Whole new concept. And then finally, of course, if the government doesn't protect our rights, the people have the power to take them back. So what we giveth, we may taketh away, which is really the antithesis of the right-hand side, which is the king saying, what I give, I may take away. And that became almost the conventional wisdom of colonial America. Conventional wisdom is simply ideas that people believe are so grounded in truth that they don't have to give a second thought to it, they just believe it. And of course, conventional wisdoms change over the course of time. for today, an example of the conventional wisdom is men and women are equal. Now, people don't think about it, they just operate on that truth. But you go back in time, that wasn't a conventional wisdom. You see what I mean? So it's in any given time and place, it's the ideas that become so lockstep in our subconscious that we just simply operate on the basis it's a truth. And the idea is that these ideas on the right here had become the conventional wisdom of colonial America by the time Britain asserts the authority. And that is when the rubber hit the road. So you have these ideas meeting the reality of liberty being decreased by government, and something had to give. And of course, something gave very
So what's the timeline of that idea started to really?
Those ideas really began to percolate about the 1730s and 40s. It began in Europe with people like John Locke and Montesquieu and Rousseau and Voltaire, and ultimately those collective ideas became known in Europe as the natural rights theory of government. And because ultimately those ideas found their way to American schools, in which many of the lawyers went, many of the preachers went, they ran into these ideas. It came down to sermons, it came down to legal cases, it came down to editorials, the papers, and finally it's the shopkeeper and the farmer that was reading these ideas. So they percolate down through the society between the 1730s and the 1770s. But if you were to ask most Americans, not all, again, these are generalizations, obviously. You can find John Smith over there who didn't agree in any time and place. But most Americans said, yes, 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 yes. The rights I enjoy are because of their dealing to me. And now the British government seems to be tampering with these rights.
They had if I remember correctly, they had a legal premises that he who creates controls, right? And so that God was the creator, and he controls everything in his creation.
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
And then, so the idea under monarchies, particularly in Europe, the Pope, the papacy would, I forget the exact term, but they would basically, ordain the
Well, they would
the
speak
king.
what was called ex cathedra. And ex cathedra was speaking in the place of God from the throne of Peter, the chair of Peter. Yes.
Right.
So they are the mouthpiece of God.
Well, he would anoint the monarch, I think,
Precisely,
as
yes.
as being the having the right to rule, from God.
Sure.
But to my understanding, these, the pastors particularly, came and said, well, we're all created directly from.
Exactly.
Now, that was a long-standing Christian tradition that we're all created directly from the Creator. So
Certainly from the Reformation onward it was.
Right.
Yes. Because even before that, even prior to Christianity, you found the same excuse being used, or the same rationale being used in ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia. And that is why in those societies you'd always find this symbiotic relationship between monarchy and the religious group, whoever it happened to be, because one scratches the back of the other. Because if the king says, I'm operating by the will of God, how do you affirm that? You ask the priest to say, he is indeed operating by the will of God. And thus you get this circular argument of both groups affirming the other. So the monarch gives the priest the benefit of land and benefits and taxes, and the priests in turn assert monarchy's legitimate, etc. In fact, when you live in a society under divine right monarchy, it's very hard to bring about a revolution. Even as late as the Russian Revolution of the early 20th century, because you could always assert to the peasants, you're going against the will of God. And that would scare them. So you can imagine when the revolution does come, the conditions must be very severe to push people beyond that point of, well, they do and are picked by God, but golly.
Almost kind of reminds me of Roman time.
Oh, same thing, for
The
sure.
Sanhedrins and the Pharisees and the Sadducees were obviously, in cahoots with the...
Well, that's the idea. I don't have other, but basically all the societies of history match the right-hand side of that hand. Now, that was the way of which societies operated, in which you created a priestly class, a monarchical class, or ruling class, and then everyone else below it. And that's how they held power. And that's the Americans and others in Europe breaking that whole matrix. And that's what's so fascinating about the American Revolution is it isn't just the next revolution. It's really something new under the sun. The ideas being asserted for revolution is very, very new. Well, in 1775, the revolutionary period begins First of all, we have the 13 colonies seceding from the British Empire. Now that verb is usually applied more to the American Civil War, when South Carolina secedes and Virginia secedes, North Carolina secedes. But secession simply means to make a political pronouncement to the government that you are withdrawing peaceably. And that's what all the 13 colonies did. Meanwhile, they had representatives of Philadelphia to figure out what we do next. But independently, all the 13 colonies offered notices of secession from the British Empire. Well, at Philadelphia, they decided that we would have to operate not as 13 sovereign and independently operating countries, but 13 sovereign and dependently operating countries. Still sovereign, but nevertheless working with one another to each other's advantage. So, 13 sovereign states, and we find this in the document, which we generically call the Declaration of Independence, but that's the real name of the document. If you go to the archives and look at it through the glass, it'll say, in Congress, July 4, 1776, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. And notice that it is not all capitalized because they're sovereign independent states, that each one is operating independently. They're not elements of a collective whole. So it's not one body with 13 pieces to the pie. There's 13 units operating
I have a
together.
question.
Yeah.
Before they seceded,
Mhm.
the other parts of the British Empire, such as Ireland, Scotland, whatever,
Yeah.
did they have a legal precedent that was called secession is available to us if we want to use it? Or was secession something they invented in the colonies to tell them, hey,
It
we're
really began with the colonies, although Ireland will follow it shortly thereafter and get crushed pretty good.
But I mean, the British had never actually provided that in any of their charters. This is
No,
an option.
no, they really did not.
Okay,
In
so
fact,
it's-
the Americans are asserting something the British negated, just like when the Confederacy did it, Lincoln negated it. No, you're a part of the body forever. This indissoluble union.
Wouldn't that have been a mistake? Because even today we have states threatening secession.
Well,
forever.
precisely, and that was the great question of the Civil War. And we'll see in a second here that the South is operating no more, no less on this document here as their colonial ancestors had. And Lincoln, in a sense, takes the role of the British, which is, you may say it, but power flows from the barrel of a gun, which is what the king's going to say to the colonies, and might makes right. In the king's case, he loses. In Lincoln's case, he wins. But it was a concept that was...
Is there any political precedent for secession under Roman or Greek law? Was there any city-states that declared some type of independence or...
Well, the
or
city-states were
some-
operating almost semi-independently, so there was not a sovereignty above them. Ultimately, there were areas of revolution in the empires, and the empires would put down those revolutions. And again, revolution is not new in human history. I think the importance of the American Revolution is the why of it. What they're offering is why and how do we justify doing it. It's not merely to the barricades again, men. It's that the power flows from God. We have the right to do this. I used to call it in class the first people's revolution. The power was flowing from the people other than just simply disenchanted citizens of a state that wanted to modify the status quo. I'd rather be in power than them being in power. So in this document, though, Jefferson is going to, and of course it was a 5-man committee, but essentially the work was done by Jefferson with the editorial input of Roger Sherman and Benjamin Franklin and John Adams and Livingston. Okay, so it's a 5-man committee technically, but Jefferson did it. And he writes, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, that's the colonies to Great Britain, it is their right. In fact, he doesn't just say it's your right, it's your duty. We hold these truths to be self-evident. This goes back to the Enlightenment thought that had come from Europe and had filtered down through the society that had become the conventional wisdom. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That among these, and I underline among because remember Jefferson is a lawyer and he understands the use of verbiage. And he doesn't want to use a preposition that limits the list. He wants to use a preposition that makes it clear this is illustrative, not encyclopedic. So that some clever lawyer down the road says, you only mentioned 3, that's all you get. Yeah, this is just an illustration of the bigger list. He says, among these are the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to the pursuit of happiness. And then he goes one step further, because if they're contemplating the forming of government, is it going to be the same old, or something new? And he says that to secure these rights, and obviously the rights he's referring to are the inalienable rights. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers. Historically, the answer would have been what? From God, who says it to the priest, who affirms it to the monarch. Jefferson writes, no, deriving their just powers from the consent of God. It's a radical thought for this time period.
It still is.
Well, it still is, yes, indeed.
It is.
But if you think to yourself, why was it that the shopkeeper, the seamstress, the farmer didn't say, well, that's the biggest load of crock I ever heard? Because I know the power flows to the monarch. It was because these ideas had filtered down through the society. First at the universities, and then the churches, then the schools, then the editorialists, and pretty soon it became what? The conventional wisdom, where people just said, what? True. As these examples today, somebody walked in and said, you know, women are equal to men. Everybody just goes, true. You know, we wouldn't have to think about it again. Although if you went 50 years back or 100 years back, you wouldn't get that response. And that was sort of the idea here, is that these ideas had so ingrained themselves in the mentality of most colonials that they just simply said, check, agreed. Very radical ideas. Well, the revolution, of course, goes forward based on the Declaration of Independence. And remember, that was an assertion of the 13 colonies acting in unison, but they also independently were declaring their independence from Great Britain. They were all seceding independently from Great Britain. The war came and the war went. We're not going to talk about the war. It was a very difficult war. Ultimately, the American forces under Washington and other generals were successful. And if you were to be an interviewer in 1783, now the Treaty of Paris has been signed, independence has been achieved, and you were to say with the mic in their face, sir, madam, if there was one thing that your generation secured from this revolution, what was it? You can just picture that on the news at night. And that's the answer. What were the fruits of the revolution? What were the biggest end results you achieved? And their answers would have been independence and liberty. Now, maybe to a contemporary mind, we would think that they're just using synonyms. That they're saying the same thing two different ways. They were saying two different things, as we've sort of learned. Because independence here meant the political separation or secession from the British Empire. We had declared our independence, we had fought a war for our independence, and we succeeded. And on July 4th, henceforth, we will celebrate what? Independence Day, not Liberty Day, Independence Day. It meant that political breach that we had successfully navigated. But they also said liberty. Liberty from what? A powerful, assertive, intrusive national government. What are they talking about there? Or who are they talking about there? Britain. Remember the whole burr into the saddle was what? When they asserted their authority over the colonies. Intolerable. And so it was liberty from what? A powerful, assertive national government. And a struggle to retain this has engaged Americans since the beginning of the country. That great balance between how do you preserve independence as a sovereign nation and how do you preserve the liberty that was granted to us by God as reflected in these documents. So if the fruits of the revolution are independence and liberty, while fighting the war of secession from the British Empire, these nations, meaning the 13 states, and of course the word state means nation. If you look at the Declaration of Independence in the latter paragraphs, Jefferson talks about the state of Great Britain and the states of the United States. So state means nation. So he's making, we think of it more as different license plates, but to them, the name meant nation. So what we do have now is 13 sovereign nations. And while they were fighting the British, they had to decide, well, what do we do next? We've declared independence. The 13 have declared independence. We formed an army. We are fighting a war. We clearly are going to remain band together in some fashion, form, or method. What shall it be? And of course, at the back of the room, somebody would have to say, what? It's not going to be a big, powerful, assertive government, right? That's what we're fighting against. So obviously the answer is in the realm of the other end of the spectrum. And that's what we got. They established a league of friendship. Now, that's not my term, that's from the document itself. That's what they called the original United States, was a league of friendship. If you think of, for example, the National Football League or the American League in baseball, what it is a collection of sovereign business entities who have joined together under certain rules to do something. In this case, play baseball, make a profit, right? But the Browns are different than the Steelers are different than the Rams are different than the Dolphins, and yet they've joined together in a league, the National Football League, or the Indians and the Pirates and the Yankees in a league. And that's how you have to picture the original United States. It is sovereign units who have created this document so we can operate sort of at owners' meetings once a year. Right? It's not at all like today. It's a different concept altogether. It was a very, very weak government, and it was governed by a document. Just like our second government is governed by the Constitution, this was the first document of the United States. It gets a little confusing because both governments are called the same thing, the United States of America. If they had two different names, I think it would make more clear that there was two completely different governments under which we've operated. This was our very first government. And the document is really called this here, the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union between the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, Providence Plantations, two of the older terms for both of those areas. Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. Why did they articulate all 13? Because they are all 13 separate, independent, right? This is a league, it's just like lining up the names of the sports teams. It's a league among all these private sovereign entities.
Can you repeat the part about where you said there was a possibility of two names they didn't want to have on?
Oh, no, what I was saying is the original name they picked was the United States of America, and then when they went to the Constitution, they retained that same name. Thus, it becomes sometimes a little difficult to separate that there's two. It's sort of like Cleveland Browns 1 and Cleveland Browns 2. You know, aren't they both the Browns? No.
So, okay, you're saying our government prior to the Constitution, our government afterwards
Yes.
kept the name.
Yes, this is the very first government of the United States, which was called the United States of America. And then they dumped it completely. Art Modell sold it to Baltimore, and a new team emerged called what? The Cleveland Browns, but they're not the same. And that, in much the same way, they retain the name of the first country. And if they called it something else, like the American Republic, then we could say, I see there's two different things that we're dealing with. But there really are two different things we're dealing with. And this was a government formed under a document, which you can go online and read the whole doggone thing, but it's called the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. In Article 2, it's very interesting because it identifies the fact that each state retains its sovereignty, its freedom and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by this confederation expressly delegated to the United States in Congress assembled. And there's only a Congress in this first government. They don't have an executive branch, too close to being a what? Monarch. And we don't want a national judicial branch because they're going to be telling what? Us what the law is. Oh, no, if there's judicial matters in Virginia, who deals with it? The courts of Virginia. And if there's a judicial matter in New York, then New York will deal with it. So no national judiciary. How about a Congress? Well, that's sort of the board of the owners, right? So the government was only a Congress. And the 13 sovereign states in a league of friendship would come and meet in New York City to deal with various issues that they thought were germane to the whole.
That's why we're citizens first of the state of Ohio.
Well, exactly. We retained them.
And we have our own separate state constitution.
Yes, even at that time. We started off as citizens of our state, and our states formed this entity to operate certain of its businesses.
I think the proper term is citizen of the Republic of Ohio.
In republics, some of the states are commonwealths. Yes, exactly. And it isn't until 1868, with the 14th Amendment, do we become U.S. citizens. That was part of the revolutionary aspect of the 14th Amendment, is nationalizing what had been state sovereigns.
Last question on that. Separation between the two different United States of America governments prior to the Constitution and afterwards. This thing called the Articles. As of today, does it have any effect on us?
No, it doesn't, because when the Constitution went into effect, it was voted by Congress that we would simply discontinue the use of it. So it died gently.
Were there any benefits that we lost? Is really where we're going.
I suppose more liberty, and that became the problem. And this is a very, very weak government, which of course they thought protected liberty and independence. The problem was it protected liberty great, but not independence. It was just too weak to handle the national matters that a country must. And that of course led to the question of what do we do next? Do we add more power to it, or do we just go our own separate ways and work out the best deal we can? The states of New England were already talking about realigning with Britain and rejoining the British Empire at this point. The southern states were talking about the Spanish as maybe being our best allies. So there was a variety of directions it might go, but that was the problem. People came to realize liberty is great, but liberty also is oftentimes ineffectual on a political level. If you let everybody do what they want, when they want, how they want, nothing is done. Yes, ma'am?
Was there any threat from another country?
There was threats, yes. There was the threat of Britain. Britain, of course, is in Canada still, believes this will fail fast, and then they'll be able to reassert their power over its former territory. The Spanish controls everything from Florida and from the Mississippi westward. They immediately shut down the Mississippi River to American shipping to lock the West so that settlers heading out beyond the Appalachians are landlocked, can't use the Ohio River to the Mississippi. There was some various coercive powers because the powers wanted to see us fail. And they saw us as being just standing on kindling. And they thought, well, we'll just knock out one pin after the other. We'll pick up the pieces. You know?
Do you remember any particular grievances among the states that led to wanting to go beyond the Articles?
Yes, there was. Well, there were trade wars in which states had put up barriers or tariffs against the other states rather than free commerce among the states. One of the big brouhahas took place between Virginia and Maryland in 1786 over Chesapeake Bay and the harvesting of oysters. That almost went to war. The two states almost went to war against one another because oysters was used as salads today, which would be roughage in the diet. And so oysters, other than tasting good or bad, but was used for that medicinal purpose of, keeping the bowels moving. and so Maryland claimed the oyster beds are ours, Virginia claimed the oyster beds are ours, and they got prepared to go to war over it. And that's finally when Alexander Hamilton and James Madison came to George Washington and said, can we hold a conference at Mount Vernon to try to settle this thing down? Maybe if we operate on a little higher plane rather than quickly drawing for war. And yes, that was one of the events that stimulated George Washington into thinking, boy, we got a problem. There was problems in Massachusetts in which the veterans who had fought in the war and who had not been paid in the war, many of whom then got land grants out in Ohio, for example. Southwestern Ohio used to be called the Virginia Military District because all that land was set aside for veterans of Virginia and Kentucky, which was part of Virginia at that time. And it was based on rank. I don't remember the exacting, but let's say if you're a private, you could get 10 acres. If you were a sergeant, you could get 50 acres. If you're a lieutenant, you get 500 acres. If you were a colonel, you get 1,000 acres. And it was a graded scale of that sort. And you could go out to Ohio and get land which was to compensate you for your service during the Revolution. Well, that was great, but at the same time, people still had the bills to pay, the rent to pay, the mortgage, which was many years overdue in many cases. And the courts began to foreclose on this, especially up in Massachusetts. And so the veterans under a man named Daniel Shays grabbed their weapons and went to the courts to forestall it. They went to the farms to stop the sheriff from taking the properties back. And they said, no, we fought for these rights. You need to give these gentlemen who fought for your liberty the time to repay these debts as they get their farms back in here. And they said, the law is the law. And that became a great breach between John Adams at that time, who said, well, the law is the law. And Jefferson, who sort of flippantly from Paris responds, well, the tree of liberty needs to be watered with the blood of patriots periodically. In other words, a good fight can help. Well, again, they were fighting, and I think people like Washington and others said, I see the train wreck coming, and I think what we need to do is to convince that government to let us as private citizens go to Philadelphia and come up with a solution to the problem. So when the convention at Philadelphia comes, it's not an official government body. It's folks like us volunteering. Well, I'll come from Ohio. Well, I'll come from Virginia. Well, I'll come from Georgia. And we'll go to Philadelphia, where it all began, and we'll try to fix at first the Articles of Confederation. But very quickly they realized we can't fix it. We have to pitch it and produce a whole new form of government for the United States. And then the question was, when we send it back to this Congress, What if they just sent it in the shredder? That wasn't the task. And they could have, because that was not the task. The task of the Philadelphia Convention was to modify the Articles of Confederation. But it is to the everlasting credit of the Congress of the United States in this first government that they said, well, we didn't create the United States, the states did. So we'll send the document, the Constitution, to each state and let them decide. So you don't see power flowing from on high, as we more or less see today, but saying, hey, it flows from the bottom up, let the bottom up decide, and we will be governed accordingly. It's an amazing example of political liberty in many respects. It's respect to the people at the grassroots level.
Political humility.
So, I'm sorry?
Political humility.
Yes, it was. It was really a recognition of the mindset of people at that time, which is, remember, the key is assertion of authority. That's what really tripped the revolution. Taxes and the Stamp Act and the Tax Act, and that's all just symptomatic of asserting authority. You know, it was not the acts that did it, it was what it represented to liberty that did it. When they marched on Lexington and Concord, what were they marching from Boston? You know, one if by land and two if by sea. And I used to say to my students, what if they came both by land and the sea? How many Lamberts would you see in the Old North Church? 3? But the book only says 1 or 2. What do I do now? My mind operates on that weird level. But anyways, you know the old Wadsworth poem, you know, 1 if by land and 2 if by sea, and I in the opposite shore shall be ready to spread the alarm. Well, anyways, what are they going out there for? Well, they're going out to Concord because that's where all the weapons and the ammunition was stored, and they're going to confiscate it. Some people suggest if Obama's reelected, that's what's going to happen again. Well, we don't know, but it may indeed happen, but it wasn't the first time. Well, that's what they got upset about, and that's why they fought him at Lexington and Concord, you know. This is merely an assertion of authority. First you're reaching in my wallet, now you're reaching for my defense. No, we draw the line. Well, the Articles of Confederation ultimately are ended. And the second revolution, which is preserving independence but reworking liberty. Remember, the idea is the government was really, really weak, the first one, and that's what they wanted. They found out sometimes what you want isn't what you really need. So maybe we need to tighten it up a tad. Think about how liberty and independence could be better ratioed. So the Constitution, in 1789 to the present, that document has governed the United States. 13 sovereign states are going to end their League of Friendship, and they establish another political body to handle some of their affairs, this time a federal republic. A federal republic meaning that it's not a democracy. You know, it's not merely one person, one vote, the majority wins. It means that we will operate through elected representatives who ultimately they're supposed to represent the will of the people and vote accordingly using certain ratios. You know, such as every state has 2 senators, or every state has representatives equal to the proportion of the population. It's not just a one person, one vote apparatus. Because, as they said, that how the old joke used to have said that if the wolves and the lambs are contemplating dinner, and there's more wolves than lambs, they know what they're going to have for dinner. You know, and that's the problem of democracy. You know. And so how do you protect the lambs? And of course, federal represents the idea that power would be maintained on more than the federal level. The powers given to the state units, which form the country, and also to this new apparatus called the United States government.
Unless the lamb is armed.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if you know lambs, all you get is a paw. Verbal.
The first Articles of Confederation period, that only lasted for 6 years, if I right?
It was adopted finally in, what, 77, and it died in, well, in...
Oh.
The day after the Declaration of Independence is ratified, they began working on it. One of the things that dragged it out, I still it was 81 finally. They finally finished it in 77, and they finally got it ratified in 81 because many of the states had what were called sea-to-sea charters, which meant that Virginia stretched from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific, literally, figuratively. And New York did, Connecticut did, but Rhode Island didn't, South Carolina didn't. And the states said, you know, we really need to do something about this Western land situation. So finally, when they worked it out, that the states would give to the United States government their Western land. So everything above the Ohio River, for example, became the Northwest Territory, owned by the United States government. That was land that Connecticut gave up, that was land that New York gave up, that was land that Virginia gave up to this new government. And that way, none of the states had a so-called sea-to-sea charter. They said that'll give them so much power, far more than Rhode Island, far more than South Carolina. But that was the biggest hassle, getting the thing signed. It eventually worked its way out, and the document did go into effect. But for all intents and purposes, a decade tops, the first government of the United States was operative. It was still operating. See, you have the first Continental Congress, becomes the second Continental Congress, becomes the Continental Congress, becomes the Confederation Congress. It just sort of melded from one to the next as the document was being worked on. But government went on, even if the document wasn't finalized. But the document is, for the second United States of America, is not the Articles of Confederation, but it's called the Constitution. We now use the word of the United States, but if you go to the archives, or if you look at documents before the Civil War, from this time period to the Civil War, the name of the document takes its name from the opening of the Constitution of the United States. Right page here. Okay. It says, we the people of the United States, in order for a more perfect union, provide for and will go to establish justice, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States. Not of the United States, but for the United States. Now, for was there to make sure that everybody understood that these entities were still sovereign, yet joined together in a new type of union. Of means that they're constituent parts of a single whole. And of course, that's what the Civil War changes, because as one historian of the South put it, after Lincoln crushes the South, he said, before the Civil War, we spoke of the United States as a plural. The United States are going to have a foreign policy. The United States are contemplating an emissary to China, because it's correct. For example, if I said, the people in this room are going to take a break momentarily, but if I said the people in this room is going to take a break, you go, well, he's not very smart, is he? You see what I mean? And yet when we say the United States today is going to do thus and so, we don't flinch, because of the whole concept that changes with Lincoln is that isn't 13 units operating as an R, it's one unit with 13 constituent units in it, and all of you with the 14th Amendment are now being a citizen of it, no longer the state. Right, so that's another course really altogether. But again, I put it up there because the conventional usage, but if you look at the original documents, it'll say Constitution for the United States, because they're talking about plurality.
I think I understand now what the controversy is. Some people think we should get rid of the 14th Amendment. Some people don't. I think I understand now what.
Well, it brought about a whole lot of things, but yeah, that certainly was one of them. Well, let's see here. The Constitution of the United States begins with one of the most brilliant political statements, I think, in world history. And yet we gloss over it so quickly because we learned it in 4th grade.
Is it to say that Lincoln and the Civil War has actually negatively taken us in the direction that we are today?
Yes, it is. That was, yes.
Everyone constantly teaches in schools that Lincoln was just nothing but a great guy, and yet they don't look at it in detail where he separated us, or I mean, he combined us into a whole, where we lost some individual.
Well, precisely. If you go back to that overhead of the Declaration, remember Jefferson said, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands, but it is their right, it's their duty. And thus, what did the 13 colonies do? Peaceably, they notified the British government, we are withdrawing from the British Empire, and they hoped that was it. Of course, the king responded, oh no, you're there and there forever. We will use military force if necessary to prevent it. When the 11 states of the South ultimately did the same thing, relying on Jefferson's document, it was all done peaceably. In fact, it was done by voting. Each of the southern states sent it to a vote of the people. Do you wish to do this or do you not wish to do it? And they voted, in some cases unanimously in South Carolina, other states less unanimously. Places like Western Virginia didn't pass it, and they ultimately seceded from Virginia during the Civil War to form a new state of the United States. But it was, again, the point is they left it up to the people, and the people voted, and so the governments of each state, Virginia did it, South Carolina did it, North Carolina did it, Tennessee did it, and so forth, they passed a law saying we withdraw our signature from the U.S. Constitution. You know, X's and O's, live in peace. And what was Lincoln's response? You can't, you won't, and I will use military force to prevent it.
Interesting, the precedent that Lincoln set was cited by such characters as Lenin, the Soviet Union, or no, well, the Soviet Union at the time. But
Yes.
for his
Bolshevik Revolution.
Yeah, he cited Lincoln. Also, I want to say maybe Stalin did as well. A couple notorious, what we consider the notorious dictators.
Sure. Well,
up
again,
here,
you know, Mao's.
Lincoln did it.
Yes, well, Mao's quip of, you know, power flows from the barrel of a gun sums up Lincoln in a nutshell, but he was more delicate in how he said it. But that's, you know, when the war is over, if this, again, remember, the South had gone in peace. There was never a violent military action. They created their own country just like their ancestors had. In fact, they thought they were acting just like their ancestors had. And they really hoped that Lincoln had read chapter 16 of the textbook, which is the American Revolution, and he wouldn't act like George III. But he did. And when the fight came, they fought just like their ancestors had. And of course, the difference was too, the American revolutionaries got aid from a foreign country, France. The Confederacy never could get aid from a foreign country. Thus, the American revolutionaries won, the Confederates lost. That's really the key. But they see themselves as identical to their forefathers in what they were trying to achieve.
Slavery was really an ancillary issue too.
It really was, yes, it was, because remember,
Perceived to be now.
yes, that in Lincoln's Union, if you want to think of it that way, if we withdraw the Confederate states, if we take that position that they had withdrawn, there are still 4 slave states in the United States during the Civil War. So it's not a free country versus a slave country. They're both slave countries fighting one another. And when Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation at the start of 1863, it only applies to these Confederate states. It doesn't apply to the 4 Union states. It's the 13th Amendment that ends that.
I've heard the quote that Lincoln didn't free a single slave. And apparently that's correct.
Well, it is in double ways. You know, usually the knock is he freed theirs but not ours, but it's true. He did not touch the ones in the Union. Why do you suppose? Because he figured if he freed Missouri slaves, Kentucky slaves, Maryland slaves, Delaware slaves, which way would they go next? You'd have a third wave of secession. They would join with the Southern Confederacy. He didn't want to push them out of the Union.
If that didn't happen, where do you think you'd be today?
That's a good what if. That's one of those good what if questions. I'm not sure, to be honest with you. I really do believe. It's ironic that after the Revolution, there was the first great wave of abolitionism in the country, partly based on the Jeffersonian ideas of people are born with liberty, partly based on emerging Christian doctrine that slavery was inappropriate, and partly from the early labor unions that said that they keep holding our wages down, so we got to get rid of slavery so that our wages will not be knocked down by the slave culture. And slavery was really dying in the North and the South until a guy from Connecticut came up with how better living through technology works well. And this was Eli Whitney's cotton gin. And that invention showed the South how they could make money a beaucoup from slavery. Up until then, it was a dying institution.
But it couldn't begin to compete with the industrialization of the North, could it?
No,
It was
that-
really progressive.
More precisely,
So
yes.
how did you mix the two?
Well, that was the water and the oil. But the big issue, of course, leading to the Civil War, as Craig was pointing out, is not the question of slavery in the States, but it's a question of slavery in the Western territories. Because when you think the United States grew westwardly by 3 great leaps, there's the 13 original states. And then the first west is where we're living now, everything beyond the Appalachian to the Mississippi. Remember, that was forfeited under the Confederation back to the national government. So all those states out there, the question became, what do we do? Nobody denied that all 13 could have slavery because they did, and it was their right. But what will the Congress do with the first Western territories? And of course, being good politicians, they split the difference. They used the Ohio River. And they said all of the new states emerging north of the Ohio would be free. And the states south could have slavery. They didn't say must have slavery, but could have it. So they hoped to handle it. And then, of course, Jefferson purchases west too, the Louisiana Territory, from the Mississippi basically to the Rockies. Big question came up there again, is it free or slave? Notice they never say, is Virginia slave for free? Is Massachusetts slave free? It's always the West because it's the question mark. and Congress has to decide that. And of course, various solutions were applied to that. Then we went to war against Mexico and got the West 3, which is everything to California. And the question came up one more time. And that became the question ultimately that the country couldn't solve, is the movement of slavery westward. In the original states, it was locked in, and states had the option of either keeping it or not. So Massachusetts freed their slaves, Delaware didn't, and Connecticut did, and Virginia didn't, and it was a state matter. Everybody knew it was a state matter. But out west is federal territory. See, that's the difference. It's federal territory. Thus, it's up to the Congress of the U.S., and that's when you get all the sides bickering and arguing and trying to get their positions.
Did every single one of the states, have it being their own sovereign, regarding their own sovereignty, did they each all have their own separate currencies?
They did, they would have script, as they called it. And script was oftentimes a locally agreed currency that might be based on a local commodity, such as if you're a farmer and the bushels of corn you can bring in, or the bushels of wheat you can bring in, or the cotton you can bring in, or the timber you can cut. It was a commodity-based system, but rather than bringing in logs to buy your groceries, the script would be equal to a cord of wood or something of that sort. Of course, the gold-silver standard was in effect as well, but it was not in wide circulation the further west you went. So they came up with a kind of a quasi-barter system. They picked something of value to the local people and then based money based on that. The problem, of course, is that when if I'm from Ohio and all my bills are based on my corn and wheat, and I end up in Georgia, I pay for my hotel, they say, out of here, Yankee. And that became part of the difficulty, the non-uniformity of currency.
Is money only just a means of exchange?
Well, it is, but you have to have two parties agreeing upon the appropriateness of the exchange.
But silver and gold was commonly used because it was such a mutually agreed upon.
Yes, it was very
currency,
ancient and widespread, yes.
So for instance, in Ohio, you might take your letters of rights to X amount of wheat, trade it into a bank for silver, and then go to the...
That's how you'd have to do it, yes. You'd have to exchange it, knowing where you're going and what they preferred, yes.
Or the United States, no, because they had the federal government had generally, not I don't think all the time, but generally had...
Well, the first
US
Bank of the
notes.
United States did issue currency notes,
Until 1832 or something.
So it was kind of a mixed-up system. But if you had the gold and silver, it was all over accepted. But how many times did a farmer out in the middle of Lorraine County in Ohio have it? But he did have the script because of the wheat he put on. But that's just a question. Well, if we go back here to the Constitution, I was saying that I think that first statement is one of the most brilliant political statements ever written. It sounds very straightforward, but think about it. And I put question marks where I think the key is. It says, we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. Now, the first question is, what union are they referencing? The Articles of Confederation, right? The League. That was the first union. So now we're trying to create a more perfect union. The next question is, if something is perfect, how do you make it more perfect? And you can't, right? I mean, perfect is perfect. So why would, are these people just stupid or are they clever? And I think the answer is they're very clever political thinkers. Because what they're saying is that, remember, the people had agreed to the Articles of Confederation. And now we, this extra constitution, this extra legal body, remember, it's not part of the government, it's the civilians who've gone to Philadelphia, are proposing this new thing. And many of the people who will now have to judge this new document participated in judging the first one. And what we don't want them to think is, why did you blow it? You guys are stupid. When you got the chance, you screwed it up. No. What you're saying is, 10 years ago when you worked on this, you gave us what? A perfect union. Now we're just trying to do what? Make it a more perfect union. I think it's one of the most brilliant uses of political language in history because it immediately offsets people getting the fur up. What do you mean telling me the word oh, you respect my word? Okay, let's tweak a little. It's a fascinating phrase that we pass over so quickly, but when you think about it, more perfect, I mean, wouldn't an editor have taken that out before they printed it? All right, so then he goes on, why are we creating this union? To establish justice, to ensure domestic tranquility, to provide for the common defense, to promote the general welfare, and here's a biggie, and to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves, and not just ourselves, but posterity. Liberty, again, very critical to these people. And it just isn't anarchy. It's the idea of, I have rights and I'm allowed to enjoy them in any way I see fit, as long as my rights don't cross the line into your rights and impede your liberty. You know? And, yes, please.
Just wanted to say that key word posterity really hit me right there for a second, because I just realized there's a debate going on that people today were not actually a part of the original contract
Oh, yes.
of the Bill of Rights and such. And here it says that you are, all of our.
Oh, very much so, yes,
It's a
yes.
part of it. But there are people, in legal terminology, that will say, your name wasn't signed on that. You're not one of the plantation owners that were a part of this contract that gave rights to these plantations.
And that is so true.
Yeah.
And yet, nevertheless, they did consider us and made sure to make this document in perpetuity.
Right. It just goes to show that somebody's out there making a scam, trying to make us think that we don't have the Bill of Rights.
Oh, yes, indeed. You know, that was old white men who did that, but now we're cool and different. Well, the question as they wrote the document was, what sort of assertion of government authority will we allow under this new government? Because again, going back, remember, it's the assertion of authority that finally tripped the wire that led to the revolution. And we created this first government thinking that we had dealt away with that because there was no assertion of authority. But then we found out that with no authority, nothing gets done. In fact, things can go down the drain real fast. So we need to put authority back in, but how do we not freak everybody out and have another revolution? And that's what the whole Bill of Rights is, an attempt to try to assuage the fears that people had that, yes, we did assert authority in this, but you have to be clear that we're protecting you by hemming it in, or we're putting hedges around it, and we're going to articulate it, not just verbally. That's just a bad date, you know, I'll promise you anything, honey. No, I'm writing it down so that you can go down the years and say, this is what the pledge was. So, amendments 1 through 10 are commonly called the Bill of Rights. They deal with, again, the assertion of power. And these amendments can be thematically organized, I think, into 4 groups. Group number 1 deals with liberty itself. Liberty from national government interfering with specific rights of Americans. Notice this is sort of the personal amendment. You know, we're not now talking of a collective whole. We're saying you. Okay, your lives, your family, your fears. This is what we're proposing. First Amendment says, notice I put it big, Congress shall make no law. That's about as definitive as you can get, right? N-O. Remember we said that to our kid when he was little. N-O. It means what? No. You know, not maybe, not sometimes, no. And that's what they meant. No. Congress make no laws respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's the only statement in the Constitution that deals with religion as well. All this malarkey about that there's a separation wall of church and state in the Constitution. In fact, if I remember I typed it, I don't know if I brought it or not. Yes, I did. So I'll get to it. I have the actual clause, and it says what it says.
You know that phrase is from the Charter of the Soviet Socialist Republics.
Which phrase?
Separation of church and state.
Oh, okay.
Okay, now wait a second now. I mean, doesn't this imply that we will, or I should say, any free exercise of religion should be separated if it says they can't make a law about it?
Separated in the sense of Congress, keep your hands on. That's the separation
That's
they
a
meant.
good thing.
Yes. In fact, they quote Jefferson's letter in which he makes that point. You know, they say Jefferson spoke of the separation of church and state. Yeah, but if you read the letter that he sent to Connecticut, it said, government, keep your hands off of people's religion and their rights. There is a separation of church and state, meaning there's a wall that keeps you out of people's lives. Of course, they use that as the justification for doing it. But if you read the document, as you do so many things, it doesn't say what people suggest it says.
Yeah, my point is that religions can say all they want about Congress. This prohibition is that Congress shall make no law respecting religion. So you should be able to go into your pulpit and say, oh, this government is doing this, and this government is doing that.
But you know how
people argue today that religions can't, the First Amendment says, no, religions can't talk about the state.
Well, that's because they silently
Yeah,
mention the rights of
yeah,
being
yeah.
501c3.
And I would argue, I was going to ask you that. In my mind, reading this, it seems that Congress will have no power to tax an establishment of religion as well, since all taxes are pursuant to an act of law.
Right.
So if they can make no law respecting the establishment of religion, aren't all taxes on religious institutions or religious establishments unconstitutional?
They are, except when the agency or the institution agrees to the terms of the United States government's tax deferred plan in the 501c3. So the government says, we're giving you the benefit of allowing your parishioners to take off on their taxes, all their donations. In turn, you are allowing us to intervene in your affairs in thus and so
But
matters.
that's a false benefit, which goes back to what I was saying about not being a part of the regional contract. The IRS today is trying to say, hey, there shall be no taxes, which is in, I think, the Constitution, or was it Bill?
Yeah, I'll get to that, yeah.
Yeah, so when they try to say that, they're trying to say that was just on those original people who signed. That's the scam I was talking about.
Mhm.
IRS is trying to make us think that we are subject to their taxes.
Right.
I would argue that contract's not binding because there's no quid pro quo. Right? What is Congress offering here?
Mhm.
They're offering nothing. They're saying we won't impose upon you a power that we don't have. Oh, great.
Well,
That's not.
under common law, you were not allowed in the United States to tax people's ability to work. Of course, then they redefine ability to work as wages, and they can tax wages. Just the semantical alteration of language there. But let's see here, so we have bridging religion, freedom of speech, of the press, or the right of people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. So they're saying, if you don't like what we're doing, speak up. If you want to have a meeting outside the building, do it. Gotta be peaceful. And everybody says, okay, and we won't cross the liberty line. But yeah, say what you want, when you want, how you want. The press, speech. Now, of course, there were laws governing slander and so forth. So they can't say everything you want without penalty. It's not the government that can say you can't say it. It's somebody suing them. You said this about me, and I'm going to sue your rear end off. That's fair. So that's the First Amendment. Again, it deals with those particular, generally individual rights. As I was mentioning a second ago here, the media and many politicians and educators routinely inform Americans that there is a wall of separation between church and state found in the Constitution. First of all, have you ever heard of this before? And the answer I would imagine is yes. Where in the Constitution is this wall found? Because that is the only mention of religion in the Constitution. It says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And by that they meant a state church like Islam in Saudi Arabia or Iran. A state church. You belong to it or you suffer the consequences of it. Or churches throughout history, you could find other examples. I just decided to pick a modern example of it. Or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And they say, do as you wish. But Congress, you better not try to make one faith it with negative consequences for the rest of the population.
But also, wouldn't that prohibit the free exercise thereof, cover the fact that 503C shouldn't have ever been put into place?
Well, I'm not sure how to answer that correctly because I don't know the law well enough to answer, but I'm guessing that because the government granted benefits in return for your acquiescence, there's
So
probably...
first of all, if you were free
Yes.
to exercise your religion, you're not under any submission to the government.
No, that's
But
true.
you sign a contract with
Where?
them when you become.
Well, you have to file the paperwork with the
No, no,
IRS to become
that's what I'm saying, is that 501c3 should be invalidated from the get-go because it says, they should not be allowed to interfere with any kind of religion. They shouldn't be able to offer it anything or take away from it.
I tend to agree with you, but the courts do not.
Yeah, no, I mean, that goes to my argument that, that contract should be null and void because the government isn't offering anything under that contract. They're simply saying, we won't enforce upon you a right that we don't have. So how is that a benefit?
Where did the 501c3 stuff originate from? Does anybody know?
IRS.
Yeah, it's part of the Internal Revenue Code. I
And
believe.
the IRS is not a
So
division
in
of the
other
U.S. government.
words,
No.
there was none of that stuff,
It is
501c3
a subdivision of the World Bank Corporation,
The Federal Reserve and the IRS?
which also controls the politician's payroll, by the way. There's a subdivision of that called the PPO. It's the politician, every politician gets a check that says this is from the office of the PPO, which is a subdivision of the IRS and a foreign corporation. So when you get paid as a postal worker, your check comes from a foreign government, basically.
Well, if we have four groupings, as I see it under the Bill of Rights, the second grouping addresses the means of protection and resistance if the national government becomes too strong, too assertive, too oppressive, also deals with old fears about the use of national armies and the continuance of militias. Because remember in the past, when King Louis XVI wanted to assert his will, the military was used as the arm of doing that. So they're afraid of this. So how do we, if this government doesn't respect our rights, protect ourselves? And second of all, how do we protect ourselves against the use of armed force by the government? Well, the Second Amendment secures for Americans the right to keep and bear firearms. This is the basis of the legal gun debate today. And the Second Amendment also sanctions militias, which in our day and time is asserted to mean National Guard, Army Reserve, units of that sort. Back when the country was founded, all of the male citizens over the age of 16 years old comprised the militia of the particular community in which you were living. Just like the men that responded to Lexington and Concord. That was the militia, that was the citizen body of troops. Why would the Revolutionary Generation Americans demand that the amendment be included? Well, let's go back to the Declaration of Independence and its rationale. I just thought you had to be dyslexic. There we go. And I am, it doesn't even help. Why are governments established? Remember going back to Jefferson, that to secure these rights, your God-given Bill of Rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the government. That's the first premise. What if government doesn't protect its citizens from their legal rights? That whenever any form of government becomes obstructive these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government. The revolutionary generation that asserted that by force of arms is not going to give up that right with this new thing they're creating. And that's why the Second Amendment was there. It wasn't just to make sure everybody could hunt. It was to make sure that when that government became too oppressive, you, the people, operating as the citizens' militia, could defend your home, your property, your family. The Third Amendment provides for the right to refuse to house soldiers in private homes without the owner's consent. That was an old practice used by Britain, but it was also a way in which the soldiers could search your belongings and ultimately identify what papers you had, what weapons you had, and so it was used as sort of the spooks of that time period. They'd be in your house looking around for what you had, cataloging what you had. The third group in the Bill of Rights are the rights in court and when under arrest, because obviously that's going to happen. And before it was either the state courts or the local courts that had jurisdiction over you. Now we're adding another level, which are the third article courts, the federal courts of the Constitution. So the Fourth Amendment gives citizens protection against unreasonable searches and seizures by government. The Fifth Amendment protects citizens against punishment without due process and guarantees equal protection before the law. It simply means that all laws must be administered by established rules and applied uniformly to everyone. So if she's a lady and she's a lady and he's a duke, but we're just all regular folks, they can't be treated differently than us. That's the idea, that the law has to be applied fairly, evenly to all individuals. It also guarantees protection against having to testify against yourself in a criminal case. Now, that was partly humane, but partly it had to do with the concept of torture, that they didn't want to introduce the idea of torture and you'd ultimately confess. But notice that it says a criminal case. If one is sued in a civil litigation, all that's at stake ultimately is property, money. And thus you must testify. But in a criminal case, it's your freedom or your life that's at stake, and thus they cannot compel you to testify against yourself. So that was the other more legal concept. The practical one was they didn't want to do the thumb screw on you, but the practical one was is that you have so much to lose, others have to prove your guilt. You cannot be forced into confessing your own guilt.
That was in response to that, was it the British Star Chamber?
Star Chambers, yes.
So they would convene some, I forget the guy. It was a famous Englishman who was basically, taken to the Star Chamber, and they held him in secret, and they, supposedly came up with a confession. They had no witnesses.
Oh, yes.
That and they didn't produce any witnesses. And one of his lines in trial was, bring these witnesses. You say you have these witnesses. You said I've done these. Well, bring these witnesses before me. Make them at least testify to my face. And if they're going to lie about me, make them lie to my face.
Yeah.
And that's another reason why that trial is often cited for this justification. That
oh yes, it was. Well, first you were guilty until proven innocent, and then if they proved you guilty with evidence that was inappropriate or malign, then you had no recourse. And of course, the torture was a very common practice, used also to get you to confess to whatever they wanted you to confess.
Thank you for sharing that, because you helped me to understand a little bit why the Bible says that there's got to be 2 or more witnesses.
Yeah, that was
In order
Jewish,
for-
that was
in order
ancient
for-
Jewish law that required
Oh, yeah.
2 independent
Thank you for sharing that.
witnesses.
You helped me to understand that more.
Which is why, in the end, you remember with the story of Jesus, is they brought false witnesses, but they wouldn't find him guilty until he spoke, and they said blasphemy and off with his head and so forth. But the witnesses, yeah, they had to find 2 corroborating witnesses. The Sixth Amendment secures the right to a speedy public trial before an unbiased jury for criminal offenses. The right to be told the nature and the cause of the accusation, the right to be represented by legal counsel. Seventh Amendment secures protection against what is commonly called double jeopardy. We didn't get you this time, but we'll keep trying. Once you're, notice under common law, you were innocent. Under admiralty law, you're not guilty. And that's what we use as admiralty law. So you're found not guilty. We didn't prove it. You may not be innocent. We can think O.J. Simpson has a good use of the difference between those 2 words. Was he innocent? Probably not, but they didn't prove him guilty.
Another real interesting fact, there's a restaurant in Akron that puts a radio ad out that says, come on in and we'll talk to you about the Constitution. And by the way, do you know about the American flag?
Oh,
Joe.
That's Joe's restaurant,
Where is
yeah.
that?
It's on Main Street, it's Joe's restaurant. Anyway, it's an Italian restaurant. And the point is that if you go into court and the flag has the yellow fringe around it, that's the admiralty law, and you can move to have your case, you can move to have your case moved to a civilian court with a real civilian laws and flag. Because all courts today have been, because I think our country went into a state of bankruptcy and the
1933.
there was a change in all the courts since then. And you started to say, it used to be you were innocent, don't prove guilty, but now, and under military and admiralty law, which is every court today, you're guilty until proven innocent. They still run through the facade of trying to make it look like you're getting a fair trial. Okay, so even...
Well, even in the courts downtown in Akron,
Sorry.
you'll notice that no longer is the emblem of Ohio in the court, so there's no pretense that you are under the jurisdiction as a sovereign of Ohio. And second of all, the flags are all gold fringed. Notice that also behind the president. In fact, I saw recent pictures of the various last presidents, and I said to my wife, I said, I'd be really curious to see when the last president was that didn't have a gold fringed flag behind him. I'm thinking it might be Kennedy. But from that point on, there are always gold fringed behind them, and even the military officials have a gold fringed flag.
They claim that admiralty law is only supposed to be the law of the sea and the air, is what they call it.
Yes.
And at the time, it was just the law of the sea.
Sure.
But what they say is, well, it's the law of the sea and the air. So admiralty jurisdiction extends throughout the seas and on the land, 20 feet above the land.
Yes.
So we claim that we have jurisdiction on the land, but it's 20 feet above the land. So you need to come in and say that you want constitutional courts of the land, but otherwise we'll assume that it's, admiralty courts because it extends
Exactly, yes.
And don't cross the bar.
Yes.
There's a lot.
yes.
Don't what?
Cross the
The
bar.
bar, because
The bar.
it's synonymous with entering the ship, and where the ship's captain is the supreme law.
And today, you have to pass the bar exam to become a lawyer.
That's British.
But yeah, I'd like to move that we have one of our group meetups at Joe's Restaurant and support him.
Yeah, Joe's
That's a
great.
good idea.
He's a
I
wonderful
really want us all to go there and see
I like that idea.
He's got a huge sign on the wall in the restaurant that explains why the flag is specifically detailed in the Constitution, not Constitution, somewhere in our government, it's just specifically designed in a certain way. And if you make any variance to that at all, you're breaking the law. I mean, there's a lot of laws about don't burn your flag and all. These are things you hear all the time, but it gets more detailed.
Well, here's another one that goes back to Lincoln. Until the Civil War, as you would travel about the United States, the only flag you'd see flying in any state was the state flag, unless it was a federal installation. So you went to the post office, there it was. You went to the fort, there it was. The naval is. Other than that, there was no U.S. flag flown because you were under Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and that happened to be where the feds operate. Where now, of course, it's universal. Well, but then again, that's the 14th Amendment. There's really been 2 constitutions, not in a literal sense, but in an application sense.
There's the federal government, and then there's the state constitution.
Mm-hmm.
Any office of a federal basis or nature in Ohio, or in any state actually, is an extension of the federal government. That doesn't, when they say, well, that's why it goes back to when I say, you want to always say you are a citizen of the Republic of Ohio. You do not want to say you're a citizen of the United States of America, all in capital letters, because that is defined in Black's Legal Dictionary as a corporation. So that's where I was touching on earlier. But you want to be a citizen of the Republic of Ohio. Look that up.
That's very true. Great points.
When you go to apply for your license, it'll say, are you a U.S. citizen?
Yes.
You really need to learn to say the right answer there. We'll get into more of that later.
Well, go ahead. You are.
It goes back to how God gave the monarchy supposedly their right to rule and so on, but yes, its constitution is a movement where the people declare, hey, he gave it straight to us, and we give it to the government. It's a backwards way of thinking to people who don't understand history. But with the licenses, it is a privilege, not right, because the government is giving it to you if you are a member of their group, in all capital letters, the United States of America, which is defined as corporation. So that's why it's a privilege, not a right, to have a driver's license. It's something they're giving to you. Say, if you declare yourself as a citizen of that group, you can actually drive.
The proper answer would be what?
Oh, well, you can say, if you want to go through the necessary.
I'm a natural.
If you, natural. That's right. You're a natural citizen of the Republic of Ohio. But anyway, you can go through the processes and get your own license plate on your car and your own driver's license papers. You don't actually need a state driver's license.
The Supreme Court has a case, it's an older case, but it says, that the people do not, people have a right to travel on, public highways, public roads, because they're owned by them. They are the public. It's only kind of under this legal
You
jargon.
have to have a license if, you have to have a license if insurance is required for the vehicle.
Basically,
So by insurance, you ultimately.
It starts with a birth
Commercial
certificate.
code.
Your birth certificate, your name is in all capital letters. They make you an asset of the corporation by doing that. That's a legal trick. If you start with rescinding your original birth certificate and having it redone correctly, then you go and apply for the other licenses I'm talking about. You can get away from the government and the state IDs and all the tracking.
Yes, and there's the $629,000 bond that's taken out at your birth that ultimately becomes the basis for them repaying you with Social Security benefits.
It's just like our government prints fake money out of thin air. They say, oh, now you own us. Or it's that reserve system in the banks where they say, we're going to loan you money on money that we just printed up. And then they get it back from you in interest. It's something they never had to begin with. It's another system of saying.
Some of you might have to leave here, so we'll go on and we can pick up the conversation here. Okay. The fourth group is the protection of liberty. And again, defining the limits of the assertion of authority. Again, if that shows up again, that's because Americans have always been afraid of the assertion of authority of government. You see this in the 9th and the 10th Amendment. The 9th Amendment is the rights are not limited to those listed in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Essentially the same point as the non-inclusive preposition used by Jefferson in the Declaration, namely the government cannot limit, reduce, or eliminate the unalienable rights granted by God to all people. And finally, the 10th Amendment, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, that means they've been created, nor prohibited to it by the states, are reserved to the states and the people. So let's ponder for a moment as we end here this last amendment in light of the enormously powerful government that operates in Washington. What are the powers constitutionally delegated to the United States government? This is wild. In Article 1, there are only 18 powers granted to the United States government. To collect taxes, to borrow money on credit, regulate commerce, establish rules of law and naturalization, as you do at the present, coin money, regulate value money, blah, blah, blah. Establish post office, post roads, promote science, establish inferior courts to the Supreme Court, define and punish piracy and felonies, declare war, haven't heard that one for a while, raise and support armies, raise and support a navy, make rules governing land and naval forces, call state militia, execute laws and suppress insurrection, provide for organization and discipline militia, govern, seat of government, D.C., and other federal, i.e. Western lands. And as mentioned, that problem of slavery became germane at that point. Make laws necessary for carrying out forthcoming powers. Does the government of Washington assert more authority, and that's just not familiar again, than its delegated powers?
Can I ask you to touch on the collect taxes part, since in the Constitution it says they shall not tax?
Well, yes. In fact, I marked that section just to read. It's right above habeas corpus. Of course, the habeas corpus clause, the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless in case of rebellion. Of course, the recent NDAA section 1021, 1022 is moving to negate that. But right below that is another one. It says there should be no capitation or other direct tax levied on the American people. Now, capitation is another one of these old words, but if you think of it as when they are going to use the guillotine, you will be what? Decapitated. You know, so it means they can't tax you on your head individually. Now, the Constitution does provide for taxes being enumerated among the states proportionately. So they can say, we've got $1 million tax bill and you've got 20% of the population, so you get 20% of the bill, and you got 13%, you get 13%. You know, it does allow for taxation in that fashion, but they cannot tax us, which required a constitutional amendment during the 20th century to reverse that.
And I'm confused.
So you're saying they have to tax states, but not individuals?
They could tax the states, yes. The states are responsible for paying a debt declared by the government proportionate to the size of the population.
So the root question I'm trying to get at is,
Yeah.
how do they come to you and say, well, you make this much, and the state owes 20% of this certain bill, so you might have to give a little more than the next guy because you've earned more? Or how do they work that
Well, that
out?
would be up to the states at that point.
Yeah, is it just up to the state as to how to figure out how to get the money to pay the government?
Yes, but ultimately it's the tax code that flows from the 16th Amendment. That ultimately reverses that capitation clause of the Constitution. And then the feds, as well as the states, and even local now, define from that the right to tax per capita.
I mean originally, before the 16th Amendment.
Yeah,
How did the states figure out which farm in Ohio was going to pay most of that?
those were local taxes.
They had
Local and county
They had
taxes.
local and
They
county
did have
taxes.
local and county taxes.
They would collect that and then, okay. So the
Yes.
enumeration into each state and all that was based on just somehow they had a local or county tax, and maybe that was based on the size of your land.
Precisely. So if, for example, Ohio received a bill from the government as of 13% of the population, then it would be up to the legislature of Ohio to ultimately figure out a way of then taxing a commodity, taxing the land, taxing something among the citizens. But it had to be by the people directly involved in your life, not the feds taxing you on your head.
So the government is supposed to be in charge of the post office. So
Yes.
what would be the solution then to,
That was Ben Franklin's idea.
I was gonna say, what would be the solution then to all these layoffs and, the post office going bust? It's obviously in there that it's the government's responsibility to
Well,
the post office.
they won't eliminate it, they'll just reduce it.
Let's slow it down and make it more like email.
I mean, there's nothing to say that we can propose an amendment to the Constitution to take out the post office.
You
Well,
can
that's
amend,
true,
yeah,
too.
you
You got
can
one-
amend anything in that
you got-
document, and it
you got-
has
you
been
got
amended a number of
two,
times.
Because I was thinking maybe it should just be privatized instead of it being
Well, and we
monopolized.
are to a large extent.
What's the actual language? I'm curious if Congress can just say, well, shall the Congress create a post office, or just have the policy?
This is a direct quote from it. I took that right out of the document, so that is the language right there.
Where is it? So,
Can you show
The
it?
post office,
yeah, where is it?
established post office and post roads.
So they have the power to do it, but it's at their discretion.
Yes,
So if they wanted to, they wouldn't have to have a post office.
precisely, yes.
So they don't
But
have to.
it was to encourage commerce, travel, development of the country,
We
movement of
could
commerce.
privatize it if we wanted to. You're right, Greg. Thank you.
So as we conclude, last thoughts here based on that's the U.S. government. I mean, that's what the founders said they can do. And everything else, of course, resolved, as the 10th Amendment says, to the states and to the people. It's their job to figure out how they wish locally or at a state level to operate all the other problems and difficulties and measures that come up. So remember, these are powers not delegated to the U.S. by the Constitution nor prohibited to it by it to the states or reserved to the states respectively to the people. Why? Because long ago Americans realized that government is essentially litigation of liberty. When you vote in the primary next Tuesday or in November's general election, revere the Constitution and save our liberty. And that's sort of the bottom line of the talk, which is, remember that a lot of people believe, died, fought for that concept, and some folks are chipping away at it, and we still have the ability to fight if we can. Whether it's a losing fight or not isn't the point. The idea is to fight, to stand up for what you believe in.
Does anybody here know that whether or not Ron Paul is, his track record of voting always based on a constitutional kind of a basis is very, very good. But does he have some kind of a list of these other campaign candidates that have voted in a way that would make them look very bad if it was brought to light? Is there like
I've not
list
seen
of-
a document, although he has made the quips in the recent debates to that effect.
I wonder if anybody
I've
can
seen
research.
I've seen some,
Well, you have that.
I had an email.
You have it on our
I had an
website.
email that had a list of Santorum's voting record. I think one from Gingrich too. And it actually went to all the votes that Santorum had done in the Senate in approving, this, for instance, he voted to approve, Sonia Sotomayor to the district, or to the appeals court. And like just about all of the votes that he had. I just got that from an email list.
Yeah, well, the current scam going around right now is they're trying to make it look like that Ron Paul is only attacking people other than Romney, like he's secretly working with Romney. So we need to find a list. If you haven't seen the news, this is what they're saying.
Yeah, I know.
But if you can find a list
Yeah,
of
there's a
things,
BP deal in the works.
if you can find a list of things that Romney had ever voted on that would be anti-constitutional, we could use
See,
that.
the problem is he was never a federal official.
He would just.
So you'd have to judge him in terms of Massachusetts Constitution.
Yeah, okay, right, yeah. And he was never a congressman either.
Well, thank you, I appreciate everybody coming out. God bless you all.
Very good.
Very good. I was going to ask you, do you know, we were talking a little bit about the lead up to the Civil War.
Yes.
Do you know what the role of the tariff issue played in a little bit of the history about that? Because I've always wondered, even
Yes,
in
in
the
fact, there are-
1830s, there was
Oh, the tariff war, South
fear that
Carolina
the South
threatens
might
to
secede,
secede, yeah.
and that's one of the reasons why Jackson was elected president, because he was a Southern. He's from the South, and they figured, well, the South would be a little bit, mollified with the Southern president.
Yeah, he was a
So he
Southern
was
nationalist,
really
kind of like Zachary Taylor was later on when the whole Third West comes up. They thought he was a Southerner, but he went the way of a nationalist.
But back then, the notion of what, do you know why the North seemed to be so ambivalent to the South's concerns about the tariffs? I mean, why did they keep pushing these tariffs when it seemed that the South was?
I think it had to do with what the industrial base of the United States had taken off primarily in the old North, from Pennsylvania northward. And because they were trying to now compete successfully against foreign products coming into the United States, which had always been at the foundation of people's buying habits, unless you bought locally, they wanted to cut those off in the market. And so they would tax a British product coming in, or they'd tax a French product coming in. And the South, which had to buy products either from the North or overseas, but shipping out agricultural products, the greatest export of the South was corn, not cotton. But cotton was the great cash crop of the South. And because they were shipping it overseas, the South said, what they're doing is penalizing our product in response to the Northern politicians penalizing their products coming in. And so it is not equitable. They're taking care of their own house, but they're damaging our house because of the tariff policy. And indeed, well, South Carolina, of course, goes right to the brink in 1833. But when none of the other southern states back them, they back off. But that's the point South Carolina learns in 1833. And from 33 to 60, when they secede from the United States, they worked and worked and worked the South, building up a body of support. They said, if we ever have to stand up to the United States government again, we have to act in consort. And so finally, in 1860, when they moved, 6 other states moved with them, and that was the lesson they drew from that crisis with Jackson. If you stand up alone, you'll be swatted. If we stand up together, maybe we'll succeed.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I wonder about this a lot. In the beginning of our country, God and God we trust,
Mhm.
it was just a carryover from the church in England, this concept of God, we based it on God we trust. But then later on in the Constitution, we have this idea of freedom of religion, which isn't what is God, our country is based on that. But we have freedom of religion, which technically means all different Buddhists, it's contrary to us.
Well,
How would you
many of the founders used the synonym providence as opposed to God as part of the idea that it was a generic enough term to cover a lot of bases. So if you're...
But that doesn't call them really using the word providence. I think God is the one that I always have heard.
Well, at the end of the Declaration of Independence, he used the word providence.
Does it?
Yeah.
Okay. But why in God and we trust in our money?
Well, I think because
That's
overwhelmingly the
racist.
country was
That's
Judeo-Christian, and God was the term that was used as opposed to Deus or some other Latin term. They wouldn't have picked a Latin term because they would have thought that they were Papists, Catholics. You know, they didn't want to pick an Anglican term because then what they wanted to do was to pick a term that struck people as politely generic where it doesn't offend anybody. But that was the nature of the population at that time too. Is that
It was
really?
like the mindset, kind of like you
Yeah,
said.
it's like picking a term today. I can't think of a term that we just generally use, but if we went 200 years down the road and the body of what we're talking about changes dramatically, and the term would seem antiquated.
It's kind of like when you mentioned, at that time, the idea of men and women being equal.
Mhm.
You know, back in that time, the mindset, it wasn't involved.
Well, all ideas have a genesis. You know, all ideas start with a thought. Somebody thinks the thought, and they share the thought, and maybe that local group agrees or disagrees with it, but if they agree enough, then it spreads to a larger body, and it spreads to, it's fascinating to look at the history of thoughts that fail. But ultimately, the history of thoughts that ultimately become enormous world shakers. And you can go back almost to the genesis of the idea of the individual who might have written about it or articulated it in speech. But remember that these people in the United States at the time we're talking about are either dedicated Christians or nominal Christians, you know, but rarely were they complete open agnostics. They may have been, but they didn't openly. The Congress, the Constitutional Convention, for example, when they hit some of their real hard days, Benjamin Franklin called a time out and he said, we need a day of prayer today. We need to ask God. He helped us at this time during the Revolution. When the Revolution got to be the worst, we took a day of prayer, we all went to our churches, we prayed for God's intercession, and He helped us. I think we need His help again. So here's this body that took a day out for prayer, and they went to their churches for prayer. Now, of course, there was no coercion, which is if I decided that I was going to go have a margarita, then I went and had a margarita, you know. And I think that was the idea, that was the general consensus of the day, but there was not a coercive element to it. Well, if you don't, woe betide you. And so when it ultimately was introduced on the coinage, it just simply reflected the mindset of the
I think it's
population.
more, I think it's more of where you're not being forced to believe in a particular religion or have any
Religion exists all around was the idea, but they can't force you.
Right, or dictate morality to people. And I hope that makes sense. Does that make sense? Okay. In other words, a lot of them were, you know, believers. A lot of them were Christians, but they felt like they didn't want to force it or impose it on others. Because once you force something on somebody, you take away their free will. And you know, in Judeo-Christianity, God doesn't force His will on humans. We all have what's called free will or free moral agency.
Well, you brought up the idea that it all developed from the bottom up, and then the people's consensus mindset was God, and that all came in.
Well, it was a very strong force. Like I said, a lot of what I said had a generality to it, because you could find the exceptions to what I was saying.
I hadn't heard about the word providence at the end until you...
Yes, the blessings, it's the very last statement. First they give what's often called the word just went out of my head. It's the statement where they pledge their lives, their sacred honor, and their fortunes to the cause. And then they ask for the blessings of God, blessings of providence on us and our posterity. So providence is, George Washington uses that word very frequently in his writings during the war and after the war. It's not an uncommon use of the word. Partly it reflected the old Judeo idea where they use synonyms for God. They wouldn't even use, even in Israel today, if you go there, it's a G-D. They won't use the middle verb or vowel because of that. If one takes a Bible and you see the word Lord in all caps, it's a replacement for the word Yahweh. But they wouldn't dare use it out of reference and fear. And so they, many ages ago, began to use the word Lord. In Israel today, they use the word Hashem, for example. They say, well, I prayed to Hashem, which means the name. So again, they're synonyms for a concept, and at the time, the most easily recognized synonym was God at that time. But in Europe, they would have used Deus, Domini, other similar
In
words.
recent years, in the political arena, there has been the talk about God and our being.
I know, that's an unfortunate thing, isn't
And
it?
that, it's crazy, it's just crazy. Where's the separation of church and state when our topmost political leaders are, anyway.
But,
Anyway.
but you know, during the Revolution, there was a body that was colloquially called the Black Regiments. And the Black Regiments were the preachers in their black garbs from the pulpit espousing the cause of liberty. So it was a very
A number of the people who first led the charge at Lexington Concord were preachers.
yes.
I went to a really neat, it was actually just citizen rifle marksmanship training. Just open to the public. It was named throughout a mile. And but during the breaks, they set up targets and they teach you, how to hold your rifle and how to shoot well and stuff like that. But in the breaks, they would give little they would speak about, do like a recreation of some events from the Revolutionary War. And I hadn't realized how central the preachers were to establishing the ideology of freedom, of independence, of liberty, individual liberty. This the notion that we get our rights directly from our Creator, that we don't need a king to get the word of God, and we make just laws that we are creations of God, and therefore we can create our own government to serve us. We don't need to be managed by a government. And, just these ideologies, and real, like you said, the Black Regiment. These were preachers who, in many cases, led the charge.
Yes.
For the.
I was going to say too that people throughout our history also poo-poo people. Don't forget that it may have been a general feeling of a lot of folks, but a lot of folks didn't agree, and they said it. I think, for example, of Stonewall Jackson during the Civil War, a devout Christian, and he would not post a letter that would be traveling on Sunday because he believed it violated the Sabbath. Things like that. He had a whole series of religious strictures that he operated under, not just personally, but as a commander. And a lot of men just said, they called him old blue eyes, crazy. So you made fun of somebody, so that's how you handled it. If you didn't agree with it, you said it. So it may have been a universal, or maybe a near universal norm, but there was also people who just said, and that was part of your liberty too.
You said in the last talk that the percentages of people that actually wanted the revolution and the independence were maybe only a third.
Maybe a third or so, yes, diehard revolutionaries willing to die for the cause. Some fluctuated, like in Philadelphia, they ran up the Patriot flags when the Patriots were there. As soon as the British moved in under Clinton, all the Union Jacks went up, People are people, In fact, I used to say in classes, I said that as the revolution comes, you can really identify these four groups with regard to the question of what is the proper role of the colonies with the British Empire. That's the question. Of course, the radicals said, what? Time for the split. You had the loyalists who said, unless they do something heinous, we're loyal patriots, we stick with our country. Then you had the moderates who said, well, why not just stay with sanitary neglect? It worked for so long, why mess up with the way things were? And then was it Benjamin Franklin's position until the British government insulted him when he goes to London. And then there's a fourth group. I always told the class, I said, every era, every day, in our time and place, there's the ambivalent and the undecided. I said, undecided is what? Y'all make a good point. I don't know who to pick. I said, that's a realistic thing. You make a good point, you make a good point. I like revolution, I'm a patriot. On the other hand, I said, you found people like that. And people, of course, are saying, well, good question, but, I got to diaper the kid, or I got to write my term paper. Life goes on, and many people aren't thinking of this 24/7. They're doing their jobs and thinking about it on the side. And then, of course, the ambivalence, which is, I don't know, I don't care. And you get that today too. So they were like us. You find all of the groups, but the diehards, the ones who were willing to die for the cause, that's maybe a third of the population, and others flowed among these groups.
The only thing I disagree about the founding fathers saying they're willing to die for their cause is when General Patton said the object of war is to make the other poor dumb bastard die for his cause.
Yes.
They gave power, not on the taxing.
And I think most of the soldiers would have said amen to that too.
But back to the information, if you're interested.
Unless you want to lead us.
I pulled up the webpage, I want to share with everybody.
Yeah.
If you want to see more about it, there's a really good book here by Peter Hendrickson called Cracking the Code. So if you're ever wanting to look up some of that information on the history of the tax law.
Oh, yeah.
And how the IRS has been scamming us to this day. Now, I will give you this one warning. He was put
Right
in
to get from
jail.
federal penitentiary.
He is in jail. He was found guilty of a scam because IRS controls the courts.
Yeah.
So they didn't like what he had to say, and he is now in jail. Just like we have in Ohio's prison today, we have a couple people, I think it was from Massachusetts, that defended their home when the IRS came to them.
Yeah, I remember
That
that.
they're actually in Ohio's prisons. I don't know how that worked out. It was a federal prison here that accepted them, but they lived in Rhode Island or Massachusetts or something, and they had this fight against the IRS. They were willing to stand up against the IRS, but because there wasn't enough support from the rest of the people, IRS overpowered them.
Yes, we have a number of friends in Columbus who have tried to assert their rights against the IRS, and again, they're in the red line of the prisons too, because
And they
You're
throw
up
away
a-
the key.
Yeah,
I
they-
mean, we need to support these people who are standing up for our rights too, because we could be next. But this book gives you a really good history on what the IRS has been doing and how, like I said, about birth certificates, driver's license. If you want to get all that information, pick up this copy.
I would appreciate that, thank you.
Maybe
If you did the
check it
next
out.
meeting, you can write it down for me, or,
I can email you.
all right,
Sure.
want the address in now?
Oh, in 1 second.
Thank you, everybody. There's literature, if you're interested at all in literature involving the positions of Ron Paul. Some deal with specific issues, others deal with the collective issues. There's buttons, which we found over the course of time is a very nice, polite, non-threatening way of having people ask a question, and then sometimes they're just interested. Sometimes they're causes of borders, we're afraid to say it. And feel free to avail yourselves of any
Bumper
literature.
stickers too.
Yard signs, bumper stickers.
Is there a cost for all
No.
this stuff?
There's a donation jar, but it's not obligatory at all.
We pay for all of this one.
It's
all free.
yours.
Jan, make sure you take a yard sign too, because that's great to put.
In
For
my-
advertising.
In my neighborhood, I don't know.
Well, I've had one stolen already in my neighborhood, but I just keep putting them back up.
I would like to.
Yeah, and a bumper sticker, that's
Once
great
was a-
advertisement too.
Once when somebody stole one of our other yard signs, Jeanette made a hand-painted one, which ended up on the news. It said, "Some open-minded liberal stole my sign from the front yard."